Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 9 of my series on the Mexican Revolution, The Fall of Pancho Villa. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the combined forces of Zapata, Villa, and Carranza had forced Huerta to flee to exile in Spain. The presidential chair was now vacant, so the question was, who would sit in it? Carranza thought that he was the obvious choice, but no one else did. Hoping to prevent a civil war between the rebel factions, several leading Carrancista generals worked with Obregon to hold a convention at Aguascalientes, which was attended by delegates from the Carrancistas, the villistas, the zapatistas, and various independent factions. A temporary alliance between Villa and Zapata ensured that Carranza would not become president, but they were unable to forge a permanent alliance. When regional leader Eulalio Gutierrez was appointed president, a furious Carranza fled Mexico City to Veracruz, but seemed unlikely to survive. Fortunately, Villa arrogantly marched his army near the convention to remind everyone that he was in charge, driving Obregon and other independent leaders to join Carranza. While the personal conflict between the two men was a key factor, Villa and Carranza genuinely disagreed on several issues. Carranza wanted a strong central government, was very anti-United States, and stridently opposed land reform. Villa wanted provincial autonomy, was favorable towards the United States, and was partially in favor of land reform. Carranza and Obregon were driven into alliance by a shared fear of Villa, but neither man trusted the other. Still, they were no match for the Villista-Zapatista alliance, except Villa pulled out of Mexico City and returned north. It's unknown exactly why he made this decision, but he likely realized that Zapata would not welcome a foreign army, even a supposed ally, in his territory. Zapata had spent the fall of 1914 recruiting more troops, even attracting ex-federal officers to train his army. With their aid, Zapata led 20,000 men to capture Puebla on December 16th, so he was poised to drive Carranza out of Veracruz. However, Villa's reign of terror in Mexico City had unexpected consequences. Zapata was waiting at Puebla for artillery promised by Villa when news arrived of the Villista rampage in the capital. Many of Zapata's men already saw no reason to risk their lives so far from home, so a disgusted Zapata returned to Morelos with his most loyal forces, signaling the end of the fragile Villa-Zapata alliance, which had lasted less than a month. The men who remained at Puebla were beaten by Obregon in early January, and he then occupied Mexico City. Since Zapata was focused on Morelos, the struggle would be between Villa and Obregon. Outside observers believed that Villa would win easily since he theoretically controlled most of Mexico, had already notched up an impressive number of victories, and was overflowing with charisma, unlike the lifeless Carranza. However, Villa was beginning to believe his own publicity and listened increasingly less to his advisors. Whether lack of interest in any part of Mexico outside of the provinces of Durango and Chihuahua was the cause, his army was noticeably less effective outside of his home territory, while Obregon's army was even more professional and not limited by an attachment to a specific region. A key factor in Villa's successful campaign against Huerta was his access to weapons from the United States, but that advantage disappeared when World War I started and American arms manufacturers found that they could earn much more money selling weapons to the European nations busy slaughtering each other. At the same time, Carranza controlled the nation's two main ports, Tampico and Veracruz, which were the outlets for most of Mexico's exports, and the war in Europe had greatly boosted prices for Mexico's oil. Even so, the war initially favored Villa. Villista General Felipe Angeles had captured Monterrey, the third largest city in Mexico, by January 8th, and Villa won a victory at Guadalajara with a daring cavalry charge in mid-February. With the northeast under his control, Villa sent General Urbina to capture the vital port of Tampico, but he was defeated by General Jacinto Trevino, a graduate of the National Military Academy who was a real general. Worried that the Villistas would eventually capture Tampico, Obregon decided to lure Villa into directing his main army into a less important area rather than reinforcing the offensive in Tampico. Observing that Villa was far too dependent on cavalry charges, Obregon adopted the defensive techniques used on the Western Front in Europe. Celaya was picked because of its flat terrain and many canals, and Obregon filled it with men, barbed wire, and machine guns. Many machine guns. It was obviously a trap, but Villa's ego would not allow him to ignore the trap, so he launched 10 separate cavalry charges on April 6 that simply produced growing piles of bleeding, moaning men and horses. Rather than wait for artillery to pulverize Obregon's defenses, Villa somehow managed to persuade his cavalry to carry out more charges the next morning. Although they almost penetrated the lines several times, the cavalry was too exhausted to solidify any gains. Realizing that the enemy was dangerously weak, Obregon launched his own cavalry charge, causing a rout. Instead of retreating to a more favorable position, Villa's pride took over and he made another attempt at Celaya a week later. Obregon simply waited patiently while Villa burnt through his troops in futile attacks. A cavalry charge at dawn took Villa's men completely by surprise and sent the proud division of the north fleeing in panic. The repeated defeats proved that Villa was a disciplined, charismatic cavalry leader, but not a real general. Most important, the defeat showed that Villa should have worked harder to preserve the alliance with Zapata. Unable to defend Mexico City and face Villa, Obregon had taken his entire army with him when he marched out of Mexico City to provoke a battle with Villa at Celaya. This was a huge gamble, since there was a very good chance that Obregon would find himself besieged somewhere, while Zapata blocked the vital supply route from Veracruz. As expected, Zapata's forces moved in, enabling President González Garza to return to the city. However, Zapata refused to block trains moving supplies from Veracruz to Obregon at Celaya. The Zapatista occupation of Mexico City should have been an ideal opportunity to restore the national government, but Zapata proved to be uninterested in any other institutions of authority. Tired of Garza interfering in Morelos, Zapata soon agreed to Villa's request that the government move to Chihuahua, where it would be protected by his forces. While Zapata may have understandably reevaluated the merits of an alliance with Villa, his narrow perspective was dangerous. He was only interested in Morelos and the surrounding region, and he now controlled Morelos and the surrounding region. So he seemed to have concluded that he had won. Furthermore, since he occupied Mexico City, he denied the national capital to any other faction. Zapata's short-sighted strategy is difficult to understand. Maybe he doubted that Obregon would defeat a major defeat on Villa, which seems likely given Villa's track record. Maybe he worried that a victorious Villa would be as dangerous as Carranza, also plausible given Villa's track record. Anyway, it is unknown since Zapata never explained his strategy. Obregon pursued Villa, who made a stand at Trinidad, and the two armies ended up facing each other from opposing trenches. Villa seemed to have accepted that frontal cavalry charges did not win every battle, but he did not employ his superior mobility to send troops around Obregon's main force and cut the railroad that was his lifeline to Veracruz. After a month of both sides trying and failing to find holes in the opposing defenses, Villa lost patience and threw 35,000 men at Obregon's lines. Despite heavy fighting, Obregon's lines remained unbroken. However, an artillery shell shredded his right arm, and he would have shot himself to end the pain, but his aide had cleaned the pistol and forgot to replace the bullets. Surgeons saved Obregon's life by amputating the arm, while Benjamin Hill, his second-in-command, carried out a devastating counterattack on June 5th, forcing Villa to retreat again. I will step away from the fight between Villa and Obregon to take a quick look at Mexico as a whole. Since Carranza had failed to solidify the revolution and install order, Mexico became a mess of competing factions, while American owners of land and businesses in Mexico were pushing for an intervention to end the chaos. Seeing an opportunity, the German government hoped that bringing Huerta back to Mexico would keep America too occupied to sell weapons to the Allies, while the German agents wanted to disrupt Mexico's oil industry, which supplied 1/4 of global oil supplies. Huerta had been persuaded to return to Mexico by a German operative, Captain Franz von Rintelen of the Imperial German Navy. Orozco had stayed out of the fight between Carranza and Villa after Huerta resigned, since both men would have executed him. Working with other exiles and supported financially by the Terraza Creel faction, he was trying to build up a force to invade Mexico, hoping that Huerta could unite the many exiles spread throughout the U.S. and Europe. Enrique Creel offered Huerta command of Orozco's force. Traveling from Spain to the United States in the spring of 1915, Huerta reached El Paso, where he planned an uprising with Orozco that attracted support from right-wing generals, politicians, and rich landowners. Unknown to the German agents, their scheming was not secret. The British had recruited Czech nationalists who placed agents among the missions and offices of the Central Powers. Therefore, when Huerta met with Rintelen, they were observed by Czech agents. Furthermore, Carranza's agents kept track of the Mexican exiles in the U.S., and American agents became aware of the plotting, so Huerta was watched by 3 sets of agents. When the American government learned that Huerta was moving towards the Mexican border, he was arrested on June 27th for violating U.S. neutrality laws. However, the problem was not solved, since the town was full of Huerta partisans, including local business leaders, and the mayor of El Paso volunteered to be his attorney. When Orozco escaped on July 2nd, Huerta was arrested and offered freedom if he left the border area, but he refused, so he was transferred to Fort Bliss. A sheriff's posse found Orozco and 4 companions on August 30th, killing all 5 men who were thought to be rustlers or bandits. It was a sad end for one of the key leaders of the revolution. In the end, Orozco was out of his depth outside of Chihuahua and had allowed his ego to be stroked by the Terraza Creel faction. But the primary factor seems to have been a deep personal resentment against Madero that drove him to ally with oligarchs to fund his own revolt and then to ally twice with Huerta. Given his repeated alliance with oligarchs rather than genuine reformers like Vasquez Gomez and Zapata, Orozco was clearly driven by a desire for personal power. Huerta died on January 13, 1916, from cirrhosis of the liver caused by a lifetime of heavy drinking after spending 5 months in detention at Fort Bliss, possibly by choice, in order to avoid a villista or Carrancista firing squad. Okay, back to Villa. Unable to produce a long-term plan other than hide in Sonora, which had no railway, Villa was abandoned by his more stable followers, including the Madero brothers, Jose Isabel Robles, and even Angeles, his best general, all of whom made their way across the American border. General Urbina, one of the 8 men who had ridden across the Rio Grande with Villa to fight Huerta, had fallen out of favor, not for unrestrained looting and military failure, but for retiring from the revolution without permission, which resulted in his execution. When Carranza offered amnesty and a generous demobilization payment, most of Villa's surviving army accepted. Actually, Villa was a victim of his previous success. He had recruited a professional army with the promise of regular salaries and proper equipment. When he lost control of his base in Chihuahua and Durango, he lost the ability to pay those salaries. He lacked broad-based popular support because he had failed to offer a reform agenda that promised to improve people's lives. Defections and infighting continued until Villa's army of 50,000 men had shrunk to 12,000 when he entered Sonora. The trek across the mountains was deadly, and Villa's pet executioner Rodolfo Fierro found himself trapped in quicksand while the rest of the army watched as the terrified butcher slowly sank to his death. American President Woodrow Wilson had tried repeatedly to arrange a reconciliation between Villa and Carranza so that the Mexican Revolution would follow the course that Wilson felt was best for Mexico, failing to recognize that a national revolution would follow its own course. However, Wilson had accepted that a more reasonable third candidate would never appear, and since Villa's recent military setbacks had eliminated him as a candidate for president, Carranza was recognized as the legitimate president of Mexico on October 19, 1915. Wilson had been strongly encouraged by his new Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who wanted stability in Mexico so that the United States could focus on the situation in Europe. When Villa's exhausted troops finally reached Sonora, it was already under Carranza's control. Frustrated and out of options, Villa decided to attack Agua Prieta on November 1st, but it had been turned into a daunting fortress by Plutarco Calles. An angry Villa learned that the officially neutral United States had permitted Carranza's troops to cross American territory in order to reinforce the garrison at Agua Prieta, which was located near the border. Worse, when Villa's men made a nighttime attack on the trenches, crawling over the ground in order to make their way through the barbed wire fences, powerful searchlights supplied by the Americans suddenly lit the sky, transforming the villistas into defenseless targets as they wriggled frantically to escape the relentless machine gun fire. The blatant American interference convinced Villa that the United States wanted to make Mexico into a protectorate, which was unfair to Carranza. While Wilson did hope to exert influence over Mexico's political process, Carranza was a die-hard Mexican patriot and had only accepted American aid to destroy a dangerous enemy. When Villa met with his surviving generals on December 22nd to plan another campaign, they bluntly refused to participate. Left with only his most loyal men, Villa returned to guerrilla warfare, but the numerous intellectuals who had attached themselves to Villa's movement as clerks and advisors had no patience for the hard existence of life on the run and deserted, making their way across the border since Carranza's offer of amnesty applied only to soldiers. Instead of admitting that he had been outfought, Villa blamed his repeated failures on betrayal, which was reinforced by the mass defection of most of his generals and army. Many went a step further and joined Carranza's army. Other senior officers carved out small domains where they ruled as strongmen and/or bandits. Less than a year ago, Villa had led the largest army in Mexico, but he now rode into the mountains with 200 devoted followers, and everyone else believed that his career was over. To be fair, if Villa had been a typical strongman, he could have fled to a comfortable retirement in the United States or Cuba. Instead, he decided to fight and die in his home. At least Villa had survived while his two main enemies, Huerta and Orozco, had both died. To sum up, the alliance between Villa and Zapata seemed unstoppable, except it broke apart after a month, leaving Villa to face Obregon on his own. After several carefully planned battles, it became clear that Obregon was a far better general than Villa, who was forced to return to guerrilla warfare after most of his followers were either killed or accepted an amnesty. With Zapata contained in Morelos, Villa sulking somewhere in the mountains, and both Huerta and Orozco dead, it appeared that Carranza could focus on rebuilding war-weary Mexico. Except Villa managed to completely transform the situation in a single day. And I will explain how he nearly started a war between Mexico and the United States next episode. Thanks for listening.